Ja, also ich habe mir zwei Dinge aufgeschrieben.
Thank you. I've noted down a couple of points. Firstly, I think a fair result on the basis of research of this kind would have a different result, because I don't know whether everything has been investigated that could be investigated. I've got a couple of trivial points. Where does the cadmium come from? I mean, if you've already detected just what the animals are suffering from, a high level of cadmium, then it's rather strange that all these investigations have taken place and the Commission is looking at fluorides and chlorides, but nobody's asking about cadmium. So obviously this is picking up on Mrs. McGuinness's point. I think we have to become active on this. It's quite simple as far as I'm concerned. You have to look properly, investigate it, and just find out where this cadmium comes from, and as quickly as possible, because I think enough time has already gone past. And maybe Irish public opinion would be interested in this as well. And it's a great shame. The family's economic existence is threatened. But, I mean, all of us are biological creatures as well. And I would imagine if the animals on the farm are suffering, well, what about the human beings on the farm as well? So we really have to react and act. And I must say the last sentence, and this is my last point, the last sentence, it just says in the reply from the Commission, to this extent, the information from the Irish authorities has filled some of them, but not all of the information gaps we had. Well, that's not satisfactory, I'm sorry. And I think really the Commission should really have hammered down on this, because if the Irish government and the authorities provides them with information, then the Commission sees that this information is not complete, then I really think they ought to be asking more questions. So we really have to do something, and urgently.
Honourable Harkin.
Mrs. Harkin, please.
Madam Chairperson, I'll be very brief. I won't repeat what has been said. I want to thank the petitioners for their excellent presentation. They leave us in absolutely no doubt as to what the situation is, and anybody who's been following this case will be very clear as to what's been happening. One or two points that perhaps haven't been picked up by others I'd like to mention. We were told about the recommendations from this committee to our department about carrying out liver biopsies, post-mortems, etc. And yet our petitioners tell us, with the exception of 2 post-mortems carried out 5 months later, none of those recommendations were adhered to. I think an explanation is due for that, because, I mean, this committee here was trying to work with the Irish authorities to ensure that a proper investigation was carried out, and it gave recommendations, and it seems that a lot of those recommendations were ignored, and I don't think that's good enough. Secondly, anybody who reads through this document here will see the foot-dragging by the Irish authorities, and as our colleague has said just a few moments ago, the final sentence says that the Irish authorities have filled out some but not all of the relevant data gaps. For a petition that's been here since June 2006, that is just not acceptable, and that's why I agree with Mrs McGuinness that it's not enough for the Commission just to write to the Irish authorities and wait for a reply and then assess that reply. I think they need to take stronger action on this. The evidence is there, and finally, I agree with so many other speakers, the levels of cadmium that have been discovered, and then that those who actually discovered those levels are ignoring them because they can't believe the evidence of their own eyes, is extraordinary. And I genuinely believe that in that situation the Commission has to act in a stronger way than it has been acting up to now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can really understand why people would get rather annoyed and rather concerned with this whole process. I don't think we can close this petition, because we'd be turning ourselves into a laughingstock as the Petitions Committee if we were to do this, and we would be removing a sort of last hope and last expectation of people if we were to turn this down, this particular petition. All of this reminds me of a similar case I had in the Allgäu at the foot of the Alps in my own constituency. This is a dairy region, and we had a very similar problem. We found very high levels of cadmium when we carried out examinations on both animals and human beings, and we saw that there was a glass smelting and colouring factory, and we know that cadmium is emitted at very high levels in this kind of factory, and it was said, well, it couldn't come from this. The cadmium couldn't come from this particular plant, and tests were carried out over years and years, and it was always said that the cadmium levels were below the limits in this factory. And I went on a factory visit, and the actual process is a sort of daily process. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's when the temperature arrives at the highest level, and then you get the glass products during the day. And for years and years and years, the tests were carried out, but at the wrong time of day, when there were no emissions. And this is why they weren't able to detect this. But we were able to detect this ultimately, and the plant was closed down. And I don't know whether this is the only solution possible, but in the case of the petitioner, we've seen that the cadmium is there, but nobody really knows where it's coming from. And I think we have to look at this. We have to find the source of the cadmium, establish the link, and come up with a solution. And I don't really know what more we can do. We can say, obviously, we're not satisfactory with this report, and turn to the Irish authorities and the Commission and write to them urgently and say that they really have to investigate this further along the lines we're suggesting to clarify the situation.
Mrs. De Bruyne, please.
Much, and I too will try to be brief and not to repeat the very strong points that have made by colleagues that have spoken to date. But I agree that in light of the length of time that this committee has been looking at this issue, much less that the length of time that the issue has been an issue, for us to be left still with gaps of information, stated gaps also by the Commission in terms of the information that they have, and the fact that we don't have the information, particularly in relation to the levels of cadmium. I think not only must the Petitions Committee continue to pursue this, but we must become more proactive, and that the Commission must become more proactive on this issue.
Onorevole Childers.
Yes, I too will be brief. I'd like to congratulate the petitioners on their persistence in this matter, and also to sympathise with their suffering that has gone on for so long, and those of the animals. This is an animal welfare issue as well as the human suffering involved. This is the place of last appeal. This is what the European Union is for. But it should never have gone this far. The situation should never, ever have gotten to this point where we're sitting here now after 19 years. But given that the levels of cadmium are undoubtedly high on the farm, and the Department of Agriculture in Ireland has dismissed their own cadmium samples, can the Parliament ask the European Commission to carry out an independent analysis of the levels of cadmium on the farm? Thank you.
L'onorevole Wertmann.
Ja, danke schön. Auch ich möchte mich meinem
Thank you very much. I can agree fully with what the previous speakers have said. I particularly admire the family for the patience that they've had for this lengthy battle. I don't know anybody who's fought over such a lengthy period, 19 years. But what we have to do now is make sure that that we investigate the cadmium levels. Everybody's been talking about the animals, but the family has 4 children, some young children as well. And we have to think in terms of the human beings as well, because we know that cadmium in blood is extremely dangerous for human beings as well.
Mr. Businaro.
Domnule președinte, am ezitat dacă să iau cuvântul.
I hesitated.
Și totuși.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hesitated to take the floor, but however, 19 years is absolutely unacceptable to solve such a file, no matter where, in a European Union member country or in a country that is not in the European Union. Secondly, I am deeply shocked by the lack of credibility of the official data produced by the competent authorities in Ireland about this case. You don't have to be a scientist to understand the shocking nature of this data, and I'm also shocked that there is no answer given to a very simple question. If there is such a high level of cadmium contamination, where does it come from? Because I'm sure it was not the petitioners who inoculated cadmium in the livers of their animals in order to have these results. And even so, the first obligation the authorities had was to look and check whether the samples had been manipulated or not. Instead, the authorities say those results are so high that they're not credible. Well, isn't it their duty to find an explanation, a scientific explanation for the incredibly high level of contamination? Isn't it their duty to see whether there is any relationship between a possible source of pollution, the contaminated animals, and the location of this farm? All those elementary questions have not received a decent answer from the authorities. Therefore, I cannot accept the official position by the Irish authorities. And that's why I have such a huge question mark concerning the Commission's position, which relies on this information that for me is irrelevant. Thank you.
L'onorevole Paliadeli.
Ευχαριστώ κυρία Πρόεδρε. Πραγματικά εκπλήσωμαι.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I must say I'm rather surprised, just like all my colleagues, about the situation. And I must say I have every admiration for the family because I think this could serve as an example for all our citizens, whether they're faced with small or larger problems. And I must say I'm rather worried about the very bureaucratic way in which the Commission has dealt with this matter. It's quite shocking. We're not here only to discuss these kind of petitions and cases. We have to intervene as well. And the European citizens are perfectly entitled to expect this, and their rights are at stake here. And I think it really is a big mistake, would be a big mistake on our part, if we were not to intervene in a very firm fashion to ask that the Commission act.
I numerosi interventi.
Well, we've heard a lot of speakers and a detailed report from the petitioner and the people with the petitioners. With the petitioner, I think it's very clear the petition has to stay open, and this committee, I think, is entitled to ask that there be more effective action taken and undertaken than has been taken so far. So I would suggest that there be a resolution that can be put to you by the coordinators about how long it should take the Irish authorities to intervene. I don't think there should simply be passive inaction by the Commission, but that we would like to see a proper report on the matter for the petitioner and the action to be undertaken. So there can be further investigation that I think should be agreed on by the coordinators, but certainly the petition